All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome back for another Malazan chat. And I am joined here by my excellent friend, Dr. AP Canavan. Hello, AP. How are you today?
Philip, I am doing very, very well, thank you. And you see, what people don't realize is before we start, almost every single time, you say something to make me laugh. And I'm sitting here going, oh, yes, I'm going to look very, very professional. I'm trying to wipe tears out of my eyes from laughing at something you've said. You're like, okay, ready. And now we're starting, and I don't have time to recover.
That is one of my evil schemes, one of many from which you will never recover. But we are here to discuss Steven Erikson's The God is Not Willing. Yes, yes. Okay, so this is the first book in the Witness Trilogy. And it is described sometimes as a sequel to the Malazan Book of the Fallen. And that's, I think, a place we should start, perhaps, to let's just discuss for a bit the relationship between The God is Not Willing and the Malazan Book of the Fallen, and pretty much everything in the Malazan world. I think that would be a good place to start for people who are considering reading the Witness Trilogy. And later we will get into themes and things of that nature, but this will be the non-spoiler discussion. And later on, we will have a video with tons of spoilers that will be on AP's channel, A Critical Dragon. So be sure to check that out. And after that, we have something very special ready to go for you guys. And it is going to be a discussion with the author, Steven Erikson, about this book. And that discussion, I think we're going to have spoilers in that one too as well, right, AP?
Yeah, because let's face it, Erikson is not particularly good at non-spoiler discussion.
That's true.
So it's usually safer when we have a discussion with the author. Things creep in sometimes, but I think we'll aim for it to be just spoilers about the book, and that just makes it safer for everyone all around.
Right, that's right. But we're going to spoil everyone first with just the two of us, and then we'll spoil everyone later on with Steven Erikson. So lots of great content coming up on The God is Not Willing. So let's get started today, though, with the non-spoiler discussion. And I think this would be helpful for some people. So AP, how would you describe the relationship between The God is Not Willing and the rest of the books in the Malazan world?
Well, this is an interesting point because something that comes up is it a sequel or is it a new trilogy that is set in the same world? And obviously with any sort of book set in the same world, there are benefits to having read the other books.
Right.
But sequel implies you must have read the other books in order to understand it. And what I don't think that's necessarily the case.
Right.
I think that yes, if you've read the entirety of the Malazan Book of the Fallen and then read The God is Not Willing, it's a lot richer of an experience the first time you read it.
Mm.
If you've read all of the Malazan Empire, sorry, the Malazan Book of the Fallen and the novels of the Malazan Empire,
Right.
it is an even richer reading experience the first time that you read it, because you'll be very familiar with all of the different aspects of the world and everything that's going on, and have a context already set up for why certain things are happening.
Right.
That being said, if you haven't read the Malazan Book of the Fallen and the novels of the Malazan Empire,
Mm-hmm.
I personally believe it is still possible to both read The God is Not Willing and enjoy The God is Not Willing.
Mm.
Because while a lot of the world building that got done was done in those previous series, the characters in this, it is a much closer set of characters. It is a much more focused narrative story that is being examined.
Mm.
There are fewer multiple moving parts. It's in basically one geographical location, and the elements that get explored, quite a lot of them are going to be new to readers of the Malazan Book of the Fallen or the novels of the Malazan Empire, and they get explained in this book anyway.
Right.
So while yes, reading the previous books is always going to be a massive benefit in going into something that is set in the same world. It is not necessary in order to read this. And because it's a shorter novel, because it's a more focused novel, and for many, and I think you would see this in a lot of the reviews, they use the term accessible and streamlined, and this is much closer to, I think, an expected reading experience for modern epic fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
So for those reasons, that's kind of what I mean. A distinction between a sequel, which is entirely dependent on what went before,
Right.
and a book that's set in the same world but at a later period, where yes, it is going to reference earlier events, but knowing the full context of those is not necessary for an enjoyment of the stuff.
Right.
Does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense to me. And we've had discussions similar to this, I think, in regard to, for example, Ian Esselman's Path to Ascendancy, which I have always contended could be a great entry point into the Malazan world. And I think this is similar in some regards. Yes, I agree with the statement that you will probably get more out of it if you've read the Malazan Book of the Fallen. Absolutely, because there are references to events that take place in that series, and there are repercussions from events that happen in that series that are dealt with in this trilogy. So that is certainly the case, but you could read it and enjoy it and just say, would I like Steven Erikson's writing? And while Steven Erikson is sort of notorious for having a lot of different styles with his writing, so the Bocalane and Corbel Broach novellas are very different in many respects from the Malazan Book of the Fallen.
I would go as far as using the word radically.
Yeah, radically different. Yeah, so they're comedic, obviously. They're absurd, and they are bizarre, but you can see elements of that in the Malazan Book of the Fallen. It's just that this is a different emphasis. But I do think that The God Is Not Willing, for me, I'm trying to think of, if I hadn't read the Malazan Book of the Fallen, would this give the flavor of Erikson's, some of the themes that he seems to feel are important? I believe so. I think that this could be a nice entry, in a way, to Steven Erikson's writing, to say, okay, these are some of the themes this guy deals with in his books. We're going to talk about those themes in a moment. But also, I think, even though he does have the guy has an incredible range, okay? So most writers, I think it's fair to say, they have a voice that's distinct, and you can tell what they're doing. You can tell a book written by them even if you haven't seen the author's name. You get a sense for the style, just like a composer or something like that. You know that music is Vivaldi when you hear it, right? Erikson has an incredible range. I think he has a voice that is his as well, but he has this range where he can do all these different things. And so The God Is Not Willing is a bit different in some respects, I think, from the Malazan Book of the Fallen. It is a tighter story. It has a smaller cast. So it is not as broad ranging, I suppose, in some ways. I'm struggling to come up with the right words to describe this, but go ahead.
One of the things that we keep going back to, because we've been doing these videos on the Malazan Book of the Fallen, and we keep saying the Malazan Book of the Fallen is very much theme driven.
Yes.
The points of connection in the Malazan Book of the Fallen are almost always thematic, rather than narrative or character or elements of plot or elements like that. The connective tissue of the Malazan Book of the Fallen, and what makes it all hang together and fit together as one giant 10-book narrative, that is theme. And there are a couple of narrative plot elements that tie together, but much of it is done with theme. That's not the case with The God Is Not Willing. Yes, Erikson, I don't think Erikson could write something without having core themes that he wants to explore. I think that is part of what drives him.
Yeah.
But I don't think that theme is as central to the narrative in The God Is Not Willing. It is important to the narrative. It is exploring important themes, but the connective tissue is far more focused on specific narrative events and
Mhm.
certain characters.
Right.
And that's what I mean by, I think this is actually closer to what people's conception of modern fantasy writing is. Now, obviously,
Right.
done by Erikson, it's never not going to be an Erikson novel,
Right.
but it's not quite as abstract. It's not quite as postmodern, and it's not quite as playful with
Uh-huh.
expectations.
Right.
It is. It still has a very knowing eye, looking at those things slightly askance,
Mm-hmm.
but there is a more traditional approach, and it's
Right.
not that's not a bad thing for people who loved all of the stuff about the Malazan Book of the Fallen. You still get so much of the things that we love in that series. It's
Yeah.
just another way of Erikson exploring certain aspects.
Agreed. Yeah. And I would contend that, well, I think some people would use sometimes the word philosophical. I'm not sure that's the right word or not, but this is in some ways less philosophical, at least overtly, than the Malazan Book of the Fallen can be, and certainly less so than, say, the Carcanis trilogy. So yeah, in that sense, it might feel a little more conventional. And yet, I would contend that many of the themes that are important to Erikson in the Malazan Book of the Fallen, in the Carcanis trilogy, are definitely present in The God Is Not Willing. They are in the story, very much so. So shall we move on to some of those
Yeah,
themes then?
perfect.
Let's begin then with consequences as a theme. This is one that you mentioned as we were preparing for this discussion. So I'll let you talk first about what you see as the importance of, where is the importance of consequences here?
Well, one of the things that we've seen explored in the novels of the Malazan Empire, in the Malazan Book of the Fallen, is the fact that events can have repercussions.
Mhm.
Events will always have repercussions,
Yeah.
but those repercussions are not necessarily immediate. And in the Malazan Book of the Fallen, like we've seen, because of the vast scope and history being explored and things explored in prologues and elements of the prehistory, we've seen things from hundreds of thousands of years in the past,
Mhm.
and they have repercussions in the now of the narrative, in that immediacy of the narrative.
Right.
Um, what we see with this, I think, is further exploration of that. Personal actions can have consequences.
Mm.
The actions at a national level can have consequences.
Mhm.
And these things can take time to come about. And these things can be devastating on from the very personal all the way up to the macro scale of affecting an entire region or nation.
Right.
And I think that's one of the big things that kind of gets explored here is there are always consequences to your actions, and
Mhm.
you can never completely avoid them, that these things will always come up again. And I think that is a key aspect. The past is always with us in the present. The past always affects the present.
Right.
And that, I think, is central to a lot of what is going on here. Because for some people, the past is a long time ago and they've moved on. For other people, those events, they are being reminded of on a daily basis.
Mm. Yeah.
And so the perspective about events changes as well.
Interesting. Yeah. A lot of those consequences we're talking about are from events that took place in the Malazan Book of the Fallen, particularly, I think, House of Chains. Book 4 is an important one, and I'm not going to get into spoilers here. There are characters there that do things that have reverberations, major reverberations that are part of what's happening in The God Is Not Willing. And based on that, and based, I think, on what people were hearing about the trilogy, the Witness Trilogy early on, I think there's an expectation that a certain well-known Malazan character is going to appear. And it turns out that it's not so much about that character yet, but it's more about the consequences of what that character did in the earlier books. So, and that is certainly huge. And that is something that I admire greatly about Steven Erikson's writing. And I think it's terribly important that he does look at the consequences of some very difficult, traumatic things that are part of life. And these are things that could be written about in a salacious way, that could be written about in a way that is unmindful. And he is the complete opposite of that. When he takes on these difficult themes and these difficult events, he is very careful to look at the consequences. And that could be books later, many books later, it could be in another series. But it's so interesting how interconnected all these books are in that respect. So.
And that, I think, part of the training that both he and Esselmont had as archaeologists and anthropologists, they are very much aware of time and the connectivity within time. And while the rest of us go, oh, that was 100 years ago, how can that affect today? And for an anthropologist, you go, 100 years, that's basically yesterday.
Yeah.
I think one of the very strange things about perception of time, just to digress very, very slightly for a second. People find it very strange when, say, a European refers to America as a young country. And you go, but we've been around for centuries. And some of the European countries are going, the house I grew up in is older than your country. And I didn't grow up in a fancy house. The McDonald's down the street is in a building that is 700 years old.
Yeah.
It's perception of time is incredibly strange and can be culturally altered as well as on a personal level. So I think that's important to bear in mind. But the point that you were making, this is the Witness Trilogy, and people do know it and quite frequently refer to it by its more informal name of, and it's not a spoiler to say.
It's not a spoiler. Yeah.
But they refer to it as the Karsa Trilogy.
Right.
And there's a reason why it's called the Witness Trilogy and not the Karsa Trilogy.
Right.
It's not just, fancy branding. Because it's not the Karsa Trilogy. It is the Witness Trilogy. And the clue is there. It's about witnessing events in addition to tying into that particular character, because that character is important to a lot of these events. But the events that get referred to, and you refer to, House of Chains.
Yeah.
The most important aspects of those for the reader to know are recounted in the God is not willing, integrated into the narrative. It's not a recap going earlier on the Malazan Book of the Fallen. It's not a synopsis. It's integrated in, and all those little elements get introduced as part and parcel of the narrative. So even if you haven't read House of Chains, you will understand what the events are, even if you don't understand the full nuance. And that's what I was saying about it. It's not necessarily a sequel that is entirely dependent on prior knowledge. I don't think it is.
Yeah. Well, by the way, that would make a great bumper sticker. My house is older than your country, I think. But speaking of youth, another important theme, how's that for a segue, is innocence. Innocence, I think, is a very, very big Eriksonian theme, and it's one that he does exceptionally well. I have to say that a lot of the times when I find myself emotionally stirred while I'm reading his books, not always, because there are other themes that get me too, but it often seems to be around that theme of innocence. And it is something that he does really, really well, along with, I guess, coming of age and the loss of innocence. So the two things are very much part and parcel of the same theme, I think. But that's certainly very prominent in The God is Not Willing. Agreed?
Yeah, and the Bildungsroman and the whole coming of age narrative and the going on a physical quest to match that internal quest and that growth, that has been part and parcel of fantasy from almost its inception. And Erikson has always had his own personal take on it and explores it in different ways each time. And I think, again, it comes down to this concept of the repercussions and what is being valued. Because, Erikson, I think, is drawn to tragedy as a storytelling mode rather than what is much more popular, I suppose, in the modern day of comedy. Comedy in the dramatic sense, not comedy as in all jokes and laughing and clowns and stuff. But
so comedy, just for the viewers, comedy as in the sense of everything turns out fine. in the end, right? That,
Yeah, everything in the end kind of works out, that the
right.
heroes always triumph. And it's not that Erikson always ends on a downer. It's that it's balancing. I suppose you could tragedy comedy. We could go for that
Yeah.
sort of speed too. But there are costs and consequences to actions that innocence that we can see needs to be protected, should be protected, because it is one of the most precious things. And once it is gone, it is gone. You can't recapture innocence.
Right.
Um, that Erikson sees its worth and explores that, but also the downsides to it. The fact that innocence is often at the expense of understanding and experience, because once you have understanding and experience, quite often you don't have innocence anymore.
Exactly.
It's so it's looking at it's a fascinating angle to look at one of the central threads in the book, because there is a character that you do want to protect, that
Right.
you do feel for, and at the same time, in order for that character to grow, they have to grow past that point.
Right. Yeah. So there is a loss of something precious when there is a loss of innocence, in a sense. And it's something we do feel protective about. And that is something I think that he does really well with that theme. And that's one of the reasons why I find it so emotionally resonant, I think. But at the same time, the negative way of framing innocence is to say, well, this character is naive, and that's dangerous, and that could get this character in trouble. And so there is a necessity, a tragic, in some ways, necessity to lose that, and to understand this is the way the world works, and this is what it means to be grown up. And it is a world where there's a lot of pain in learning that. I think it's fair to say. So I think it's really well done. Another thing I think that isn't entirely unrelated to innocence is the concept of redemption. And that is a big, big theme
Yeah.
in The God Is Not Willing. There are several different, which we won't get into now, but we will during the spoiler talk. But
Oh, you can bet we will be talking about this at the spoiler
oh,
talk.
we have to, yeah. But the idea of redemption is maybe one of the biggest themes in The God Is Not Willing. It looms, and in a way that is, I find it very interesting, because he has me thinking about, what does it mean to be redeemed? What does it mean to be redeemable? Is that something that's just a product of my own mind? Am I redeemed when I feel like I'm redeemed? Am I redeemed when others view me as redeemed? And just, what do I have to do? A certain number of good deeds to make up for the bad deeds that I've done? So the whole concept of redemption is thoroughly explored in here, isn't it?
And that's the thing. It's concepts of what is redemption, what is forgiveness, what is acceptance, what is atonement.
Yeah.
Are all of these, and they're all different things, but you can see how they're all in the same sort of arena,
Yeah.
and explore slightly different facets of the same general area. And it's asking, typical of Erikson, it is asking questions about it. It's offering examples of things, and then asking, is that enough? It's never saying this is enough. This is what the answer.
Yeah.
Here is the answer to this incredibly complex concept and series of questions. Yes, I have the answer. I don't think Erikson has ever tried to sell anyone in anything, but the exploration for it, I find incredible. And this is one of the things I love about literature, when it poses very difficult questions and it raises circumstances and examples that we can explore in a novel, where you know what, this is getting too intense. I'm going to close the covers. I'm going to walk away, going to go to the park, whatever.
Yeah.
This is not an in your face, you have to answer this. It is a way of stimulating thought and intellect about incredibly complex things that go to the heart of the human condition, of humanity as a social construct, and what we value and what we believe.
Yep, that is what great literature does, and that's why we're in this, right? I think that's what we feel we get out of it, and it's why his books, the Malazan books in general, both Erikson's and Esselmont's, I think are just so worth discussing. So But something also, I think, related to one of the ways in which perhaps you could explore redemption and being redeemed is through friends. And friendship is certainly another big theme in this book, isn't it? Friendship.
You know what? That was a very nice segue, I'm
I'm getting
impressed.
good at these segues. I know, right?
And yeah, friendship, camaraderie, found family,
Right.
um, found mother and father figures, or alternative mother and father figures. The
Yeah.
idea of family being in part, this construct that we can make, that at different points in our lives, different people fulfill different roles.
Yeah.
But the comradeship and friendship that builds out into brothers and sisters, that
Right.
um, these are things that we see explored in a lot of different types of fiction and in a lot of fantasy fiction. And it has been something that is an aspect of the Malazan Book of the Fallen and the novels of the Malazan Empire.
Yeah.
But it is a key aspect, and it is explored here. And once again, a couple of times in slightly different ways. Fraternal bonds and sorority bonds.
Yes.
Not that kind of sorority.
Not
Different
the one
kind.
that you joined to go, live in a house with a bunch of other people and
Yeah.
party and that sort of thing. No.
Uh, but we see that explored in the book. The aspects of the military, because of course, the Malazan military is going to be present, and those who have read the Malazan Book of the Fallen, you know what to expect with Marines, or at least you think you do.
Yeah.
Um, and that's for people who haven't read it. There is a military fantasy aspect to this novel.
Yeah.
That is part of what the Malazan world is known for. That there is going to be that here, but again, it's not always about military. Let's go and kill things. It's
Mm,
about the military. It's about being in the military. It's about service. It's about the bonds between soldiers and the fractious nature of
yeah.
those tight confines that soldiers often find themselves in for long periods of time.
Yeah.
And that's one of the sources of comedy that runs through this book.
Exactly right. That's where I was going to go next, even. But
Oh, did I have a good segue?
you had a good segue there. We're having a good segue day. So, yeah, the humor is an important element in here, of course. And there is a special brand of Malazan military humor that perhaps has some relation to Glenn Cook's Black Company books and that sort of thing as well, and some of the Vietnam War era inspirations that Erikson has talked about many times. But there's a sometimes grim sense of humor, and beneath that humor, you sense this incredibly strong bond. And you also mentioned service, and I think that is a very, very important word when we're talking about the military, both in our world and in the Malazan world. This is a very important component of the God is Not Willing as well, where, yes, there's the Malazan military presence, and the military is not just about conquering in battles and all of that. The military has some other important functions, which is it is to protect society and to aid those who are in need and so on and so forth. So service is another big one in here as well, isn't it?
Yeah, but in thinking about the humor again, there are elements like I tried to describe it as a tragicomedy. There
Yeah.
are elements of tragedy here. There are serious things that get explored. There are genuine moments of poignancy and depth of emotion and harrowing concepts that get looked at. But I think Erikson balances them very well
Mm.
with some comedic elements, that
Oh
you
yeah.
have those moments to laugh out loud, to release the pent up tragedy, that it's moving between these, not in a jarring way, but as a cathartic release and a way to balance. So I
Yeah.
think that is a tonal aspect to it that is quite important to how it functions, because otherwise, there could be an unremitting grimness to a lot of what's
Yeah.
explored.
Yeah.
And there is a golden thread of comedy, of humor,
Yeah.
that runs through a lot of the book, that gives you that light even in the darkest of circumstance.
Absolutely, yes. And there are a couple new characters in here that are comedic in nature, and they had me howling with laughter. So sorry, I couldn't resist that. You have to read the book to know how bad that pun was. But yeah, so but they're great, aren't they? I mean, good stuff, right?
I'm just disgusted.
Am I in the doghouse now?
Oh, God. Stop now, please.
Okay.
Yeah, there are some brilliant new characters. There are aspects of the world actually that we get a much cleaner and deeper insight into in this book
So true.
than we did in the Malazan Book of the Fallen. I think it's going to be a revelation for some readers in the Malazan Book of the Fallen. Go, I know all about this. They're going to see it and go, that wasn't quite what I was thinking. And I love when authors can make something new in a world that doesn't feel forced. It feels like an evolution, not an add-on that has been stuck on in the end. It feels like a natural evolution of what's going on.
Yeah.
That even when they explain something that you thought you had a handle on and it gets explained differently, you go, but that still makes sense with what we knew before. Right. It's a revelation as well as evolution of things. So a lot of that gets done. And that's why, yes, it is connected to the world of the Malazan Book of the Fallen. There are these evolutions and these revelations about things and developments. It's a fascinating story in that respect.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, we talked about friendship. The other side of that, of course, is exploring the concept of the enemy, the foe, the other. And there is a lot about othering in The God Is Not Willing, isn't there? About our tribalism and our tendency to not see those on the other side as fully human. So this is, I think, a really important thing in this particular, so far in this trilogy. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I know. Of course, like in a fantasy world, you have the ability to literalize this, because when you can make the people on the other side literally not human, but some other race, that there is an external manifestation of monstrosity. But one of the things obviously is you can see that as othering and the monstrous other, or you can see it as, well, they may be physically different, there's an intrinsic nature to sentience, to what we would call like a humanity, a concept of humanity as sentient people with souls and spirits and feelings, and you know, we still have loves and likes and hatreds and dislikes. There are these elements that bring us all together as people, and the balance and investigation of how do we other, or how do we see these moments of sameness.
Yeah.
And where we draw that line is not only a very, very personal, but it can be culturally defined. It can be defined in the moment, the time period we grew up in, the country we live in, the politics, the ideologies of the day. All of these things factor into it. And it shifts over time. Yeah. And it shifts according to slightly different subjects. And we're not always aware of when we make these shifts, when we excuse something in one group, but would demonize another group for exactly the same thing because they're part of that group, not part of that group.
Yeah.
That is something that runs through our world, our societies, our lives. And Erikson plays with it, sometimes very literally. And I mean that in the sense of it has been literalized. Right. Sometimes he plays with it figuratively. And I mean that obviously in the sense that figuratively used to have, as distinct to literally. Right. But apparently I could just say literally a second time and say the second meaning of literally, because of how people misuse the word.
I literally hate that, man.
But I wandered off the point. The point was, Erikson once again explores it in different ways. Sometimes, here's about it. Sometimes overtly, sometimes metaphorically,
right,
and sometimes covertly.
Right.
And I think we see that across it.
Yeah, for me, one of the maybe the most beautiful aspect of the Malazan books in general, and I'm including both authors, Erikson and Esselmont, are these poignant moments of transcending tribalism where you see these connections between people. There's this moment of connection, and it's just such a beautiful thing to witness, and both authors do it so well, and this book is no exception. The notion that we can see ourselves in someone that we thought of as the enemy, and there are just these moments when things just turn in these books that I find breathtaking and so important. One of the maybe that's the thing I admire most of the many things I admire in these books. That one is maybe one of the most important to me. It's just so powerful.
And it's incredibly powerful. And I think it ties into the nature of complex morality, because quite often in a lot of fantasy, we are used to and we enjoy a binary of good versus evil. And even if the character is a little bit morally gray and has dirt on their soul a little bit, they're still on the side of the angels and they're going to win out over the bad guys. And there's a definitive bad guy, and we know who we can dislike and we know who we have to like. That is something that we enjoy reading. Look behind me. I have a lot of books where that is like one of the central aspects. I enjoy it. But one of the things I enjoy about the Malazan world is it's more complicated than that.
Yeah.
And if you think of the real world, if you think of even in history, geopolitical alliance, on one day, that country over there was the enemy. Then a treaty gets signed, and the next day, they are now our allies. That, look at the number of times that has happened through history. And try to wrap your head around that as a concept, that one day you could have been getting all of the newspaper reports about the enemy over there, and you build up an idea of who they are, and then peace has been declared, a treaty's been signed, they're now our ally, and now we're fighting these people over there who are the enemy. And that sudden jarring nature of, but what about, how can they now be?
Yeah.
And that is what we're talking about here in terms of othering, that expectations get built up about these things. But the point of connection between us is that we are all humans, that geopolitical divides, socioeconomic divides, ideological divides are just that. They are divides that are not part of our essential humanity.
Yeah.
And recognizing our essential humanity, that I think is tremendously important. But there is one more aspect, I think, of this book that we should touch on, which is character. Because people, and the reason I bring this up, again, some people say that Erikson can't write character because he uses a lot of covert characterization, indirect characterization, and a lot of that show don't tell approach to certain things. And yes, some of that is still present here, but because of the smaller cast, because of the smaller dramatis personae, because of the more focalized nature of the story and the slightly smaller scale of what is going on, the cast is smaller than to be expected, say, in a Malazan Book of the Fallen book, but it's still not a small cast. Like, you're still not talking about, and one day a hero arose and he went on a quest. It's not that small. But it's a smaller cast, and it is made up of exquisitely realized characters, some of whom are hilarious and some of whom are heartbreaking.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, well said about the characters. Yeah, I completely agree. One last thing I do want to touch on, and we were talking about othering before, and how sometimes that ceases in the face of another threat. And that could be another tribe that comes along, but sometimes it's a larger force and a natural force. There is an element, I think, of naturalism in The God Is Not Willing that is actually quite important. But the idea that humanity, we usually go around thinking we're very important, right? We think that we're the top of the food chain, and we're so great with our enhanced cranial capacity and our opposable thumbs, and we're so good at lots of stuff and we can dominate the world and blah blah blah. Once in a while, nature just kind of puts us in our place. And that's naturalism. When you realize next to this large, vast forest, we're really pretty tiny, and we're not quite so important as we might think. And there's an important element of that in here too, right?
Yeah, and again, it ties into this thing that of our place in the world, our place in the universe, and understanding our relationship with other people, but also with the world itself.
Exactly.
And I don't people I think what is it, get very upset because they can see one point of connection. They go, oh, Erikson is just banging on about this,
Uh-huh.
and quite frequently overlook the fact that it's something that has been explored before in his books, but is also something that has recurred throughout history. And quite often that is what Erikson is leaning into, not necessarily the current concern of the day.
Right.
That is almost always not his focus.
Yeah.
I think it's safe to say that he's looking at grander aspects. And this book is not polemical. It isn't didactic. It isn't some sort of pedagogical rant and screed about something.
Right.
It's an illustration of these concepts, and there is always a diegetic reason for it. There's always a narrative reason for it, and that narrative reason makes sense. It's not that it's just been added in as an excuse to do X.
Right.
No, this thing is there and is entirely explainable in entirely narrative reasons.
Yeah.
But yeah, it will tie into concerns from our world, and that again is a nice way to be able to explore things in a slightly safer space.
Absolutely. So, yeah, anything else that you'd like to add, AP, or do you think we've covered this pretty well for the non-spoiler discussion?
One last thing I would say, and again, it's to go back to the characters, is that there really are some standout characters. Again, like a lot of the Malazan Book of the Fallen and the novels of the Malazan Empire, there are great male characters, there are great female characters, there are great characters that explore different aspects. There are complex power dynamics. There's a lot of banter and soldier humor. There's a lot of humor between people who meet on a trail. There are aspects of familial relationships, both fraught and poignant and harrowing, as well as beautiful and reaffirming.
Yeah.
That there's a lot in this book, and it is not entirely dependent on reading the Malazan Book of the Fallen. If the 10-book series is looking too daunting for you, you can read this. Are you going to get as much out of it as someone who's read all of the other books? No, that's not possible. But I do think you can read this, see if you enjoy Erikson's style of writing, his style of storytelling, the world that it's in, the things that he explores. Because I think this could be the book that you read first and go, you know what? I'm interested in this. And then you can treat the Malazan Book of the Fallen as a really extensive prequel.
Yes, indeed. Well, with that, then, I would first like to thank you, AP, for your excellent company.
And thank you so much for your puns.
I know you love them.
And we do. Thank you, Philip. It is always a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thanks, AP. And thank you to all of you who have been watching this. And if you haven't read The God Is Not Willing Yet, check it out. I think it's fair to say that we're both very enthusiastic about it. I'm delighted with it, and I'm very excited for what's to come. So, but thank you all for watching, and we hopefully will see many of you in the spoiler chats that will be on A Critical Dragon.